kind of pivot over to your dad, because that really is the crux of this entire conversation. What happens? How old was he? Was it sudden, or did you kind of see it coming? Because it's also kind of a thing. I remember me and my cousin were talking about, like, maybe over Christmas, because my aunt's mother passed and she was very sick. Like, is it better to kind of have all that grief all at once, or is it better to have it kind of delayed where you know it's coming? And I still don't have an answer. So where were you on that spectrum? What happened? How old was he? And was it expected?
That's such a big piece, right? Like, which path would you rather choose? I mean, yeah, that circumstance of losing somebody, there's no win either way. But yeah, my dad, so he was a type 1 diabetic. He was diagnosed when he was like 11 or 12 years old. Had diabetes his whole life. As a typical male, he did not take care of himself. He ate poorly. He was a single bachelor, so there were a lot of things he did with his health that probably weren't the best being a diabetic. And back 20 years ago, 2006, when I was in college, he actually had a stroke when he was about 48 years old. Almost killed him. Luckily, he was fine. But that led him to a early retirement and going on Social Security disability around 59, 60, I think it was. So probably about 8 or 9 years ago. So that's when he retired, for health reasons. And what was happening was he had a diabetic ulcer on his foot, which anyone who's dealt with diabetes in your family, you know that, these ulcers on your feet that are due to poor blood flow can be very, very bad. And we were trying to get it fixed and et cetera. And the day he passed, or day before, he had a procedure with the vein care specialist that I took him to. And they basically did a stent, down his leg to try and break up any blockage to get blood flow going, et cetera. Didn't find anything. They're like, good news, bad news. You don't have blockage, but we don't know how to get blood flow going. So, my wife and I, my sister, but especially my wife and I, we were worried like, oh God, if dad loses his leg, what are we going to do with the rehab and physical therapy? And can he live on his own still? So those thoughts were going through my mind already for several months. Um, Dropped him off at the house, 7 p.m. left. He was like, text me when you get home. I was like, Will, gave him a hug, love you too. Got home, next morning, no response from him, which wasn't odd. I mean, funny joke. We had to do two welfare checks on my dad, sending a sheriff by the house because he wouldn't reply to texts and stuff. And both times in the past, he was fine. So I didn't think much of it. But then that afternoon came around. I'm like, still haven't heard from dad. It's kind of weird. Called him, no response. So the next morning, still nothing. Asked my sister, I'm like, hey, have you heard from dad? Anything? No. I was like, all right, let's do a welfare check again. And the irony of all this stuff happening was when I picked my dad up for the vein care visit, one of the first things he says is, hey, if you ever need a spare key, this is where I keep it at the house. And I'm like, all right, whatever. Thanks, Dad. And so when we sent the patrolman to go do the welfare check, he was like, hey, no one's answering. I was like, hey, there's a spare key. He's like, okay, go in, blah, blah, blah. 15 minutes later, calls me back, and that's when he delivered the news. He's like, hey, I'm sorry, your dad's deceased. Which, to your point, Will, very unexpected because, after leaving my dad 2 days before, I didn't expect him to pass away. So that shock and awe, like, oh my gosh, he passed, was huge. And then you start thinking, like, what happened? Like, that's the biggest thing. Like, what happened? And he was in his chair, seemed like he was very comfortable. Like, the patrolman was a young cop, super nice kid. And he's like, he's sitting in his chair in his living room. And so, ironically, as this time passed, we're thinking heart attack, we don't know. And I go to for my physical, because of all this, I'm like, hey, and I talked to my doctor, I'm like, let's make sure my cholesterol's good, my blood pressure, all this stuff, because I'm worried about heart attacks. And he kind of sat back, relaxed. He's like, your dad might have passed away from a blood clot. He was like, given the procedure he had, he's like, these things happen. And he said that he's like, kind of reassuringly, he was like, and if that were the case, he's like, he probably went pretty quick. And he's like, he probably felt a little winded and then, was out. So that's the tough part. But the good news to your point is, yes, there were some things in play that financially and personally that I hate weren't resolved. But at the same time, versus when we've all had loved ones that suffer, that's such a hard path too, because you know it's coming. You can prepare yourself for it, but you don't want that quality of life. And I think for my dad being only 68, and passing away, which is relatively young again. But for a diabetic with the type 1, unfortunately, it's, actually pretty good that he lived to 68. And I'm grateful it wasn't a long, gradual decline in his quality of life either.
Yeah, like I remember my mom, she talked about watching her dad suffer. He had cancer, multiple cancers, smoked for years, and the doctors actually told him he wouldn't live like 3 months after I was born, and he lived another like 20 years. So that man was a fighter, but those last few months in the hospital, like it's very tough, it's very hard, but it also kind of prepares you to have those conversations of, all right, what do you want? Is everything okay? It's not too late to kind of figure out. So before he passed, did you and your dad ever sit down and talk about money, his estate? Because like I said, he was a single bachelor, so everything he had was his. He had to have something set up. If yes, who started that conversation? How did it go? And if no, what happened? What stopped you?
Yeah, we did, man. And
Good.
with me being in the financial advising world, I was like, Dad, do you have a will? No, I don't. Let's get a will done, and especially let's get healthcare power of attorneys, these things where I can care for you and my older sister can care for you. And he was very open to it. So I ended up getting him set up. He got a will done. The bad thing, man, was he had his will, but he hadn't signed it or got notarized. He actually had an appointment. It was
Oh,
on his calendar to go to the town clerk at the townhouse or the town hall to get it done the next week. So when he passed, I called the clerk of court. I said, my dad has a will. She goes, is it signed and notarized? I said, no. She goes, well, I'm sorry, it's inactive. If it's digitally printed, which all attorneys do now anyway, nothing's handwritten. She's like, we can't take it. So I did bring it up, and thankfully, like I said, he was willing and able and wanting to do those things. Um, but at the same time, looking back, I'm like, I should have pushed it harder sooner.
yeah. You didn't know. How can you know?
And ask anybody, like, man, I have these clients with, these conversations with my clients every single week about, like, get your estate plan done. Oh, I know, I'll do it. I know it's important. I'll get to it. And man, I fell on that same sword because I was like, yeah, it's my dad's business, whatever. But the good and bad of it was my dad, again, only being on Social Security disability, had like no money. He had been renting a place for 19 years, so he didn't own a home. The car he had, my wife and I bought for him the year before because he couldn't afford one. So, going into it, it was like, oh, okay, we've got a mess here. But it was a mess in the sense of, okay, what do we need to pay for now? Not a mess of like, oh, he's got 7 properties and all these accounts, et cetera, which is equally a mess. I mean, again, for people who pass where there's a lot of stuff, that can become pretty cumbersome too.
Yeah, there's the difference between a mess of addition and a mess of subtraction. And this was more of a mess of subtraction. It's like, okay, we got to certain pay for things. So I mean, it's good you had those set up because I'm even learning, you know, something is better than nothing. And and it could always be worse. And that's one thing I've thought about multiple times over the last few weeks. It can always be worse because my story, I guess my side of this equation is we're recording this on May 19th. So not even 3 weeks ago at this point, it was the end of April. Um, Jasmine, my fiance, was literally, I was 30 minutes from driving her to the train station so she could stay at a hotel and then go to the airport the next day to go on her bachelorette party. So she was going to Vegas. She was ready to go. And I got a call. I had just finished a recording with another client, and her mom calls me. I'm like, oh, this isn't good. She never calls me. So she tells me, and she goes, yeah, like Noel, he fell. Jasmine's dad fell. And what happened was he was a contractor, general contractor. He just got a new house. He was fixing up the roof of the garage, and something he's probably done hundreds of times, and he fell and landed right on his head. Um,
Golly. And that's
yeah,
hurt.
yeah, crazy, absolutely crazy. Right across the street from his house. Um, in the hospital, they were waiting to bring him into surgery. So she goes, like, I don't want to worry Jasmine because she's at work. I'm like, no, no, she's here. She's at home. So got her on the phone, ended up driving to Queens, and, he survived the surgery, but that the swelling in the brain just wasn't going down. And, he was in a medically induced coma for a few days, regular coma for a few days, and then they had to do this test to test for brain activity. And once there's no activity, he's legally dead. So they had to pull the plug. So while all that's happening, I'm in Queens. I'm just driving them back and forth from the hospital and just being supportive and just thinking, okay, what does he have set up? What are we going to do? Now, luckily, he had life insurance. He had two policies of life insurance. So, because he was a smart guy, he prepared for this sort of thing. Um, her mom's still working. So, even just having that life insurance, but no will, no real estate plan, but everything was set up jointly with his wife, Jasmine's mother. So right now there technically is no estate, and the only mess we have is closing out his business, dealing with the house, and then there's a few of his assets like the car and this ownership of things. But overall, it could be a lot worse because that life insurance is just like, oh my god, she's gonna be okay. Like, and there's a policy in there where it's double if it was an accident, so the premium is gonna be double. And Jasmine has been paying into it as well, helping her parents out. Again, first generation Americans typically don't even have these things set up. So in the policy, she's gonna get a little bit of a payout as well for putting into it. So kind of how we navigate all those hoops while dealing with the trauma of this all of a sudden, all at once, and just the sadness of, man, this guy worked his entire life and was so close, probably a year away from retirement, to just relaxing on the fruits of his labors, and he falls doing something he's done 100 times. So it's insane. Life is a fickle bitch sometimes, but it could always be worse. And I'm glad that I have a fiance, future wife, who is very heavily involved in her parents, has a phenomenal relationship with her parents, and in this case is a blessing where they rely on her to help them with these decisions, and now relying on us to help with these decisions. And having someone like you is huge because it's like, okay, great, we can talk to Andrew, we can talk to Paul for the taxes. When it comes to estate planning, Andrew connect us with a lawyer, everything we need. So even going through all that trauma of the sadness of the passing, knowing that there was a plan to move forward took so much pressure and weight off of our shoulders as the kid, the mother's shoulder as a widow, and just it left us time to do the important thing, which was to grieve. Which, let me tell you, Andrew, West Indian culture, Guyanese culture, involves a lot of food and partying. So it was actually very nice. So yeah, I mean, like that's kind of the tale of two tragedies here, and how to navigate that moving forward. So for Andrew, for your clients and people watching this, what's the hardest part about bringing up money or end of life stuff with a parent?